Hello and welcome to 1301. This is our first lecture, and in our first lecture we're going to take a look at the way that the United States as we know it today, the way that it looked prior to European contact. We're going to focus mostly on that, and then later on we're going to learn about what happened once there is contact, which for the modern United States, the first European group to begin to colonize what we know as the United States today was actually Spain. And so we'll start with that, and we're going to break down some notions that you previously may have had, maybe not even consciously understanding, because we're going to move the narrative from like a Eurocentric narrative, and we're going to place it instead in the voice and the experience of indigenous groups. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so we call this 1491. There's actually a great book called 1491, and it does exactly what I'm trying to do, which is to tell the story of the indigenous groups before European contact. Okay, so one thing that's interesting is that historians kind of went back and forth, and I know this slide says that historians disagree on the origin, but most historians today actually don't believe that that the beginning of indigenous groups coming into the Americas was through the land bridge. And so that was a very common theory about the land bridge. But there has been evidence, anthropological evidence, archaeological evidence that they've located in recent years, and I believe it was in South America, that they actually had, they found the bones of a woman that was 30,000 years ago. Okay, and so what that tells us is that that was way before the land bridge, which was about 10,000 years ago. Okay, I will also tell you that once maize, which is corn, I'll just refer to it as corn, begins to be the main staple crop for indigenous groups, this changes the way of life of a lot of indigenous groups. Okay, they begin to, they're healthier, they live longer, it's very nutritious, much more nutritious than in Europe, where they relied mainly on wheat. Okay, and so we can see that the importance of maize to the indigenous cultures, you know, everything was really centered around maize, and we'll take a look at that here in just in a little bit. But one thing I absolutely want to drive home, if you walk away with nothing, is that please do not group all indigenous groups as one peoples in the Americas. Okay, they were hundreds, maybe thousands of different indigenous groups with thousands of different dialects. Okay, and they all had different levels of sophistication. Okay, there might have been some that we may view as not as advanced, but there's some that really did have quite advanced aspects to them. And so we'll go ahead and dive into that and take a look at that as well. But we're going to try to shed that perception a little bit. Okay, so maize, like I mentioned, around 1000 AD is when we begin to see evidence of maize agriculture. Okay, it was really popular in the Southwest, in our area, you know, of Texas here. And like I mentioned before, this really transforms a lot of the societies. We see irrigation created around maize. We see that a lot with the Aztecs, which actually they didn't call themselves Aztecs, they called themselves Nahuatl. Or they would have referred to themselves as that. But they began to have less reliance on, you know, hunting, although there was still, you know, elements of hunting as well. But importantly, this makes them not nomadic anymore. So what happens is they begin to remain sedentary. They stay in place. So that was really kind of important, right? So let's take a look at the way that maize really like shaped a lot of these communities, okay? So this is an image of like a Wichita village, and you can see that the maize is surrounding them, right? And their living area is actually, you know, in the center of that, right? And so you can see how central and important maize was just from that drawing, okay? And this is a lot of these obviously are not paintings or drawings by indigenous peoples, but they were renditions from oral histories that came down. Choctaw women were processing, harvesting, and cooking maize. It was kind of their job to do that. And even the Pueblo that are in, you know, what modern day New Mexico, right? They developed farming techniques that allowed them to cultivate maize. And with this, with the intense heat, in the New Mexico area, we see them start to use the elements of their geography, of their terrain, in order to build houses that are kind of immune to that. I don't know if you've ever been to these Pueblo dwellings before. They're still there. You can go there. They're super fascinating, like how sophisticated really that they were. Okay. Just to give you a little picture, this is a very broad type of, where different groups were. This is Aztec again. Hoodle is really what we should call them. The Plains Indians, these, here in Texas, this is where you have Comanche and Apache and different groups like that. Although you may or may not realize that the Comanche were actually a group that came a little later on. And you can see like what main source of food. And as you can imagine, the Plains Indians, they were mainly hunting. And this is because maize did not grow in that area or that region of the in the Americas at that time. Okay. One thing that happens that a lot of groups, that happens once, and this happens during, even before contact, and this happens after contact mostly, okay? And this is something called ethnogenesis, okay? So what happens with this is groups of indigenous, as they die out, especially after contact with disease and warfare, mainly with disease, we see indigenous groups form new indigenous groups. We call this ethnogenesis, and this is in order for them to survive, for their ancestors to survive. And a lot of times, that transforms the dialect and different things like that. Our greatest example of that is the Comanche here in Texas. So they were actually probably mostly Ute that migrated down from like maybe the Washington area, Washington State area, and they came there, and they melded together with other groups. Some people believe that a lot of Pueblo joined the Comanches, and this ethnogenesis created. But it's kind of an interesting thing, right? So we see this, and this shows us like a level of sophistication, right? The idea that you need to regroup and become, in order to survive, to be able to do that, okay? Another kind of interesting thing that we don't really associate with indigenous groups is currency. Okay, and the very first currency actually between different indigenous groups is the wampum beads. Okay, and so these are still in indigenous cultures today. You can see this. But we do know that in different indigenous groups, remember there were thousands of them, traded with each other. And we know this from archaeological digs. We can find like a Navajo pottery, in the Seminoles, right? In an area that the Seminoles were. And so we know that there was a lot of trading. And even when contact occurs, we know that the different indigenous groups used wampum beans to trade even with the Europeans, right? There's evidence that they were using this as a currency. The Europeans were to trade with the indigenous groups, okay? And so they actually developed, the first currency here in the Americas. And so this is another image of the Iroquois. I'm going to talk about the Iroquois quite a bit. They were a very influential group. They metamorphosized into several different ethnogenesises, by the way. A lot of times they would, conquer a group in order to build their own indigenous group more, because their numbers were dwindling. But one of the things that was kind of interesting, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about like female or male relations, non-patriarchal, and it was matriarchal really in a lot of these indigenous groups. But one thing that we see is that a lot of the Iroquois lived in these longhouses, and they had generations of families that kind of lived together. And you lived with your mother's family if you were Iroquois. That is because they saw and they derived their identity through their matrilineal heritage, as opposed to what we have here in the United States, very patriarchal form, right? You take the last name of your father, so that's a patriarchal system. It was different. They traced ancestry from your mother. And I want you to take a moment and really think about this. Why would that be? Why does that make sense? Okay. And so I want you to think about that. And once we get to the slide and we're talking about women, we can come back to that and talk about that as well. Okay. So this is an image, this is a drawing of Chinooks that were like in the California, Washington, the Pacific Coast area, using resources, doing advanced fishing techniques. But my favorite example of advanced fishing techniques are the Shoshone. So the Shoshone had this very advanced type of technique in order to fish for salmon. And I'm not a fisher person, so you know, I'm probably going to say something wrong, so forgive me on this. But I will tell you that I do know that salmon are particularly difficult to catch. So what they did was there was this Englishman that, you know, we do know, by the way, that, you know, contact was first before settlement. So the English actually, there were many English navigators and travelers that came and made contact with different indigenous groups before settlement, and one of those is the Shoshone. And this Englishman, he came and watched the Shoshone capture salmon. So he watches them catch salmon, and he's amazed at how efficient their system is. So he literally draws an image of their fishing weir, like, right, you know, what a civil engineering feat, and he takes it back to England and they implement it there. So they use Shoshone fishing weirs for their own use. Okay, so another thing that really shows the advancement was not just advancement in engineering, in you know, the economics of it with the wampum beads, but also socially. Okay, they were socially much more advanced than the Europeans were. Okay, they definitely believed in much more equity in society. Premarital sex wasn't this taboo thing like it was. It was actually very widely accepted in many indigenous groups, as was, you know, monogamy was sometimes in different indigenous groups accepted and not accepted. Okay, but we do know that women had much more autonomy, and I'm going to use this word quite often. If you take a look at this word, the word auto means self, right? And nomi means power. So self-power. Okay, so I'm going to talk about different groups and about how the type of power, the autonomy that they really had. Okay, but you can see they were able to own land and property. The husband moved in with the wife. I told you about that was matrilineal kinship, right? It was centered around the mother as opposed to the father. And I told you we would also talk about why that made sense, right? And this is going to make sense when we have a discussion about slavery too. And that is that matrilineal kinship is much easier to identify who the mom is, right? So it would make more sense to trace your heritage through your mother, okay? However, because these societies were so distinctly different than Europe, they saw this and they saw the autonomy of women of, whoa, they're savages, they're backwards, right? How would they give women all these rights? And so we obviously don't see it that way today, but we see that, you know, as a sign of greater advancement in their communities, okay? Another thing that's kind of interesting, and I'm saying this during Pride Month, so I think this fits right in, but the fact that the indigenous groups were really accepting of people that were LGBTQ+, right? So the term two spirits was what they referred to as people that didn't fall in the traditional, you know, heterosexual views of identity, right? And so they called them two spirits. So essentially what they said was this person was born with two different spirits, a male and a female spirit, okay? And sometimes it meant something different in all the different indigenous groups, but here's some of the examples of different indigenous groups that were very accepting of this two-spirit identity, right? This is really well known. And even in indigenous communities today, this is a very well accepted identity there. So yeah, so I want you to think about it. Think about all the things that we talked about the indigenous peoples, about how developed they really were comparatively. And so I want you to think about that and kind of pose the question to yourself, what were the greatest signs to you that they were really truly advanced, right? Okay, so like I mentioned before, we do know that Columbus wasn't the first one to reach the Americas, right? There's lots of evidence that he wasn't the first. And I'm not a Columbus fan, and we're going to do an activity called the Trial of Columbus, so we'll delve really more deeply into his voyage and why this is. But what's kind of interesting about Columbus was, right, he kind of ran into the Americas accidentally. He was actually in search, and I know you've probably heard this, right, before, a Northwest Passage to India. So he runs into these people that are, in the Bahamas. He doesn't know them. They're actually the Taino people. And he runs into them and he calls them, what does he call them? He calls them Indians. And he calls them Indians because he thinks he's in India. Okay. He was a terrible mathematician. Everybody at that point had already accepted that the world was round. That's a fallacy to think that he was the one that came up with that idea. That was really well documented and well known. He just miscalculated the distance and he ends up, accidentally in the Americas. Now he goes back 3 more times, folks, okay? Still believing he's hit India. People theorizing, oh, it's a different continent, da-da-da-da. He dies not believing that, okay? But he brings back 10 inhabitants, 10 Taino people back to Spain. And so that is where we really start to see European contact with indigenous peoples, and we see that really kind of ramp up. And we'll talk about that here a little more, right? So I know you've heard this before, probably since elementary school, the 3 Gs. Which groups lean more heavily on which G depended on which European country we're really talking about. But this was the real purpose, and it was beyond. So some European groups were more interested in just trading, and then others, like the Spanish and the British, are going to be much more interested in colonizing, okay? And we'll talk about Spanish colonization in particular. But what made this possible, right? And I want to back up for a minute. Columbus, we could say, right, he was not a smart dude, right? He thought he landed in India, right? He didn't. He was a terrible mathematician. He dies not believing that he did. He put girls that were 11 years old into sexual slavery. There's a lot of reasons why we can say these horrible things about Columbus, but one thing I do want to say is that his accidental discovery of the Americas is what launches, European colonization. And so we see that as the marking point. So we can definitely say that, right? But what makes it possible for these different for these different European countries to be able to trade, and that is technological improvements, right? So you've probably heard those before, the different types of ship, compass, navigation tools. But another thing that's probably not as much talked about is the joint stock companies. So those were basically people that pooled their money together in order to fund a voyage, so you wouldn't have to rely on the crown, okay? And so we see that a little later in colonization, but that does still begin to grow, all right? So you've also seen this before. You can pause it here if you want to take a look at this, but the Columbian Exchange occurs. Some were intentional trading of different things, and others were accidental. So some examples of accidental would be like the honeybee, which was accidentally brought to the Americas, right? And, disease was obviously accidentally brought over, right? So what were kind of the benefits to this, or the impact, really, not the benefits, to the different societies, okay? And by the way, you're going to see this referred to in your book, and I will refer to it as Old World versus New World, okay? That's probably a really bad term, but that's what's used, because the New World is the Americas, and the Old World is Europe, okay? So what kind of effect this has? We see huge population growth. We see, remember I mentioned before that mainly Europeans were on a wheat diet, right? And so they start to eat more corn. They live longer. They have longer lifespans. And we also see a movement away from feudalism. We don't see capitalism in America until arguably the 1800s, when we start to see factory systems come in, the early 1800s. But we do see elements of capitalism begin to encroach. And so instead of going to the feudal lord, right, we see the growth of merchants and things like that. Disease was extremely prevalent, right? So there are all kinds of different quantitative methods to figure out how many indigenous peoples died by disease, mainly by smallpox, but other diseases as well. But most historians believe it was somewhere between 80 and 90% of all indigenous groups were eliminated from the disease that was brought over by Europeans, okay? We do see some positive aspects of this, guns, horses, that kind of transform the way of life, particularly for the Plains Indians. We also see tools, farming tools. It makes it a little bit more efficient as well. And so we do see that with the side of the Americas, okay? This gives you an idea, by the way, of Spanish America and its reach. And this is why I start with Spain, okay? A lot of people start the story with the English, right? Well, actually, technically, we start the story with the indigenous, right? But the European colonization, it was the Spanish that arrived here first, okay? St. Augustine was actually the first town that was established. It wasn't Jamestown. A lot of people think that because it's very like English-centric, I guess. But St. Augustine, Florida is actually the oldest town. But you can see the different areas. This is Portuguese. Brazil is Portuguese, which is why they speak Portuguese today, right? All right, so the first time we start to see contact and settlement is with a conquistador by the name of Hernan Cortez. And essentially in 1519, he comes to the coast of Mexico and encounters the Aztec, right? Montezuma specifically. He marches to Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, and eventually he gets the trust of Montezuma and then really kind of, backstabs him. So there's different thoughts there about exactly what happened to Montezuma, how he died. Some people say that it was Cortez and his men, and others say that it was like an uprising because Montezuma was allowing Hernan Cortez to come in and trade, and they could see that there was something wrong. A lot of the Nahuatl Aztec people, okay? And so there's a video clip, and you should be able to click that and start. It's about, what is it, like 6 minutes long? It tells the story of Cortez. This is the theory that his people actually killed him. So you're welcome to, if you downloaded the PowerPoint, which you're able to do, grab that and watch that video clip too. So after the European colonization or Spanish colonization, one of the first systems that we see come into play with the Spanish was a system known as the encomienda system, okay? So the encomienda system, intentionally, with the way that the Spanish crown envisioned this, was that conquistadors and lords and people of high nobility would come to the Americas, come to, modern-day Mexico. They would colonize an area, and in return of colonizing and, getting the fruits of either a mine, there were a lot of silver mines in Mexico, some kind of minerals, or they would, farm the lands. They could reap the benefits of that. The big goal is to, they had to obviously give a percentage to the crown, but the biggest thing was that they needed to Christianize the natives, okay? And this was a big push by the Spanish friars specifically. We do know that that was for the conquistadors way at the bottom of the list for them to do that. And pretty quickly, this encomienda system, which was really hard to regulate from a distance, right, from an ocean away, turns into a form of Indian enslavement. Okay, they weren't paid. They were, beaten. They were essentially, Indians were enslaved in this system. All right. And what happens is there was one particular friar by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas that protested to the Pope and to the King of Spain for better treatment for the indigenous people. He had this concept of indigenous peoples when before he came over. When he came over, he lived amongst them for many years, and he reshaped his view on them. And so he protest and say, we have got to get rid of this encomienda system. The Indians should not be enslaved. They're good people. They have good hearts. Okay. At the opposite side of the debate was this guy named Juan Sepulveda. And basically he said it's okay that indigenous don't have their freedom. It's okay that they're enslaved because we're freeing them with Christian liberty. They're going to go to heaven because we're Christianizing them, right? So that was his justification for that. Sepulveda loses, Bartholomew de las Casas wins. Sadly, though, this becomes, Bartholomew de las Casas doesn't feel that same way or advocate for African slavery. And we see in modern day Mexico, we start to see the beginning of African slavery in the Spanish colonies first. Okay. All right. So I'm fast forwarding a lot of like colonial Mexico history because this isn't a colonial Mexico class, but I think we need a lot of background. But I will tell you that initially the Spanish said, you know what, we don't want our people to mix. We don't want indigenous to mix with the Spanish and blah, 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 right? But pretty quickly they realized that the only way that they were going to get indigenous to Christianize was by allowing intermarrying. Okay, this was something that was done in their culture. So if you wanted to blend two indigenous groups together or make an alliance, you would have to intermarry. That was something that they did. That was part of a lot of indigenous societies. And so the Spanish do this, but with a caveat. They're like, wait a second, that's not quite what we want to see, right? So what they do is they create a caste system, the Costa, Costa system. They essentially rank people by their superiority. The most superior being Spanish-born, right? And then you go all the way down to mixtures of African and indigenous cultures would be at the bottom of the social ladder, right? And so they create different names for people that are mixed with different people. And how do they envision this and how do they identify these different groups of people was through paintings. So the Spanish government actually, what they do is they commission artists to create large, and this is a small painting, and there's lots more. If you just literally Google Costa paintings, you can see a ton of Costa paintings, right? But essentially what they did was the artist had like a Spanish mom, right, and a Spanish dad, an Indian mom. This is what they look like, and what is their kid going to look like? And their kid is going to be called a mestizo, right? And so you can see that they're over here at the top. And this is cut off because the Peninsulares, who are pure Spanish, were the ones at the top of it. And then all the way down here to, I don't remember, I can't read that there, but is mixed with African heritage. And you can see just by looking at this, if you just kind of pause this and take a look, you can see how even the clothing changes, right? I mean, not only are they telling them that they're not as superior, but they're making them appear that they're poor and things like, which they probably were. But, that kind of put them into this social caste, right? So this kind of exists for quite a while in Spain. Okay, I think that is it with this. The next lecture, what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at the beginning of other empires, other European empires that come over, the French, the Dutch, and finally the British, who come the latest. And then we'll talk about the development of the Atlantic seaboard, the colonization, and things like that. Okay, but hope you learned a lot and have a great day.